3 seconds. That's all the time it took for Naomi Kinsley to snap, 3 seconds of raw, unfiltered defiance as she screamed into the face of the most dangerous man in the city. To Naomi, he was just another arrogant customer in a designer suit who had pushed her too far on a double shift. She thought she was finally standing up for her dignity. She had no idea she was actually walking into a trap that had been set 22 days ago. In the velvet-drenched shadows of the Onyx Lounge, Naomi is the picture of discipline, hair in a perfect bun, apron spotless. But for weeks, a pair of cold, intense eyes have followed her every move. Lorenzo DeVante doesn't just watch, he observes. He knows her favorite route home, the way she takes her coffee, and exactly which button to push to make her explode. When the drink spills and Naomi finally talks back, the entire bar goes bone-chillingly silent. They wait for the massacre. But as Naomi glares at the man with the floral ink creeping up his neck, Lorenzo doesn't reach for a weapon. He smiles. Because in a world of people who tremble at his name, he's finally found the one woman who isn't afraid to burn him, and he's never letting her go. The air in the Onyx Lounge was thick with the scent of expensive bourbon and the low, predatory hum of power. Naomi Kinsley's feet ached, a dull throb that pulsed in time with the bass of the ambient jazz. It was 2 a.m., the tail end of a double shift, and her patience had worn down to a jagged edge. She moved with practiced, rigid discipline, her white shirt still crisp, her bun still tight, but her eyes were dark with exhaustion. She felt his gaze before she saw him. He was a permanent fixture in the corner booth, a shadow carved from granite. Lorenzo DeVante. For weeks, he had occupied that same seat, never ordering more than a single neat scotch he barely touched. He never spoke to the staff, never looked at the menu, and never took his eyes off her. As Naomi approached the table to clear a stray glass, she felt the temperature drop. Lorenzo sat with a terrifying, military-level stillness, his white shirt straining against broad shoulders, the black silk of his tie perfectly straight. The light from a teal neon sign caught the edge of the floral tattoo on his neck, making the ink look like it was crawling toward his jawline. "We're closing, sir," Naomi said, her voice a low, disciplined rasp. He didn't move. He didn't even blink. He just stared at her with an intensity that felt like a hand around her throat. The silence stretched too long. It was the kind of silence that made the other patrons glance over, sensing a shift in the atmosphere. Usually, Naomi would have bowed her head and waited. But tonight, the weight of her rent, the exhaustion of the city, and the sheer creepiness of his silent surveillance finally snapped the final thread of her restraint. "Did you hear me?" she snapped, her voice rising, cutting through the jazz. She planted a hand on her hip, leaning into his space, her chest heaving. "I've been on my feet for 14 hours. I don't care how much your suit cost or who you think you are. You don't get to sit here and stare at me like I'm a piece of furniture on display. The bar is closed. Get out." The entire lounge went tomb silent. The bartender froze mid-pour. A glass shattered somewhere in the back. No one talked back to the man in the corner. No one even looked him in the eye. Naomi's heart hammered against her ribs, her jaw locked in a fierce, defiant snarl. She expected him to explode, to roar, or to have her thrown out into the street. Instead, Lorenzo slowly leaned forward into the light. His lips didn't curl in anger, they twitched into the faintest, most dangerous shadow of a smile. He looked at her not as a nuisance, but as a prize that had finally shown its teeth. 22 days, he whispered, his voice a deep, melodic growl that vibrated in her chest. "What?" Naomi hissed, her anger flickering with a sudden, cold spark of confusion. "That's how long it took you to break," he said, standing up and towering over her, his presence consuming the very air she breathed. He didn't look offended, he looked satisfied. The hunt, she realized with a jolt of terror, had just reached its end. The silence that followed Lorenzo's departure was more deafening than the shout that had preceded it. It was a thick, suffocating vacuum that seemed to suck the oxygen out of the onyx lounge. Naomi stood frozen, her hands still hovering near the edge of the mahogany table, her skin prickling where his shadow had just been. She could feel the eyes of every remaining patron, and every staff member, burning into her back like branding irons. The manager, a man named Marcus who usually moved with the frantic energy of a cornered rabbit, approached her with a face as white as his starched collar. He didn't scream. He didn't fire her. He looked at her with a mix of pity and profound, bone-deep terror. He didn't say a word, he simply pointed a trembling finger at the table Naomi had just cleared. There, resting in the center of the polished black marble, was a single, cream-colored envelope. Naomi's fingers shook as she reached for it. The paper was heavy, expensive, and smelled faintly of sandalwood and cold rain, the man's scent. She flicked it open, expecting a summons or perhaps a formal complaint that would end her career. Instead, her breath hitched. Inside was a stack of crisp, sequential $100 bills. 50 of them. $5,000. There was no note. No phone number. No explanation. Just the cold, hard weight of a king's ransom for a waitress who had just insulted him in front of his peers. The money felt greasy in her hands, a tip that felt more like a down payment. Naomi, Marcus whispered, finally finding his voice, though it sounded thin and fragile. Do you have any idea who that was? A customer, she lied, her voice cracking. She tucked the envelope into her apron, her heart performing a slow, heavy thud against her ribs. Just a customer with a staring problem. That was Lorenzo DeVante, Marcus hissed, grabbing her arm with surprising strength. The men who work for him don't leave tips, Naomi. They leave bodies. If he gave you that, he didn't do it because he liked your service. He did it because he's marking you. Naomi pulled her arm away, the adrenaline of her earlier rage curdling into a dark, oily dread. She looked toward the heavy oak doors where Lorenzo had disappeared into the night. She should have felt relieved. The money in her pocket was enough to cover her rent for 3 months and fix the flickering heater in her apartment. It was the freedom she had been praying for. But as she walked to the locker room to change, she didn't feel free. She felt watched. The $5,000 sat against her hip like a lead weight, a golden chain she had unwittingly let him slip around her neck. She had talked back to a monster, and instead of biting, the monster had fed her. As she stepped out into the biting chill of the 3 a.m. air, she didn't see his black sedan. The street was empty. Yet, as she began the walk to the subway, the hair on the back of her neck stood up. She realized then that the silence wasn't over. It was just the beginning of a long, quiet hunt. The following week felt like living inside a beautifully constructed nightmare. The $5,000 sat in a shoebox under Naomi's bed, untouched, yet its presence seemed to hum through the floorboards, vibrating with a frequency that only she could hear. She wanted to believe the encounter at the lounge was an anomaly, a glitch in the matrix of her mundane life, but the city had other plans. Lorenzo DeVante was no longer just a shadow in a corner booth, he was the ghost in her machine. It started on Tuesday at the grocery store. Naomi was reaching for a carton of eggs when she caught the glint of a polished black watch in the reflection of the glass door. She spun around, heart leaping into her throat, but saw only a wall of broad shoulders clad in a charcoal overcoat. The man didn't look at her, but he stood close enough for her to catch that familiar scent of sandalwood. By the time she reached the checkout, the cashier informed her that her groceries, and the 3 people behind her in line, had already been paid for by the gentleman in the sedan. On Thursday, the flickering heater in her apartment, which had been rattling like a dying engine for 2 winters, was suddenly replaced. She returned from the laundromat to find a brand new, high-efficiency unit hummed silently in its place. There was no invoice, no work order, and the landlord claimed he knew nothing about it, his eyes darting toward the street where a black SUV sat idling at the curb. The protection was a suffocating silk veil. When a group of rowdy teenagers began hounding her at the subway entrance, a man in a sharp suit appeared from the crowd, whispered a single sentence, and watched as the boys turned pale and scrambled away. Naomi didn't feel relieved, she felt hunted. Every corner she turned, every street she crossed, there was a silent sentinel, a nod from a stranger, a car that stayed 2 blocks behind her, a door held open by a man with a military posture. At work, the Onyx Lounge had become a sanctuary of terrifying privilege. No one touched her. No one complained about her service. Even the most entitled regulars spoke to her with a forced, sweating politeness, their eyes constantly flicking to the corner booth. Lorenzo wasn't there every night, but his absence was heavier than his presence. One evening, as she walked to the employee exit, she found her usual path blocked by a delivery man holding a massive arrangement of black calla lilies. "For Ms. Kinsley," he said, handing her a card. Naomi opened it with trembling fingers. There was no signature, only 4 words written in a precise, elegant script, "The streets are loud." She looked up, searching the dark alleyway. In the distance, the tail lights of a black sedan vanished around the corner. She clutched the flowers to her chest, the thorns pressing through the paper. She was safe, she was provided for, and she was being cared for with the meticulousness of a rare specimen in a cage. The realization made her blood run cold. She wasn't being protected from the world. She was being protected for him. The dressing room of the Onyx Lounge was a claustrophobic maze of vanity mirrors, theatrical makeup, and the heavy scent of hairspray and desperation. Naomi sat at her small station, staring at the black calla lilies she had propped in a water pitcher. The flowers were beautiful, but in the harsh, flickering glow of the fluorescent lights, they looked like funeral arrangements. "They're a bit macabre, don't you think?" Naomi jumped, her heart hammering against her ribs. Roxy LaRue stood in the doorway, leaning against the frame with a practiced, predatory grace. As the lounge's headliner, Roxy usually ignored the waitstaff, but tonight her eyes, sharp and lined with heavy glitter, were fixed on Naomi with a disturbing intensity. She stepped into the room, the sequins on her stage outfit clinking like tiny metal teeth. "People think he's a romantic," Roxy said, her voice dropping to a gravelly whisper as she circled Naomi's chair. She reached out a manicured hand, tracing the petal of a lily. "They see the tips, the fixed heaters, the bodyguards in the shadows, and they think it's a fairy tale. They think you're the lucky one." "I never asked for any of it," Naomi said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. She stood up, trying to reclaim some sense of space. "I don't even know him." Roxy let out a short, bitter laugh that didn't reach her eyes. "That's exactly why he wants you. You're a blank canvas. You're the one girl who had the nerve to scream at him, and now you're a curiosity." She stepped closer, the smell of her heavy perfume clashing with the lilies. "Listen to me, Naomi. Lorenzo DeVante doesn't love. He doesn't even like. He collects." She leaned in, her face inches from Naomi's. "Have you wondered what happened to the girl who had that corner booth before you? Or the singer who used to headline before I took the stage? Lorenzo likes things that are rare and difficult to tame. He buys them, he isolates them, and he puts them on a shelf where only he can see them. And once the spirit is broken, once you stop talking back and start saying thank you for the cage, he gets bored." Roxy's hand moved from the flower to Naomi's arm, her grip surprisingly tight. "You think you're being protected? You're being appraised. Right now, he's checking your value. But the moment you become a possession instead of a person, the lights go out. He'll replace you with a new curiosity and leave you with nothing but the memory of a man who looked at you like you were his favorite toy." The heavy door to the dressing room creaked open, and a hush fell over the hallway. Roxy pulled away instantly, her expression shifting back to a mask of cold professional indifference. She patted Naomi's cheek, a gesture that felt more like a brand than a comfort. "Enjoy the flowers, honey," Roxy whispered, heading for the door. Just don't forget that everything he buys eventually ends up in storage. The black sedan didn't wait for an invitation, it simply appeared at her curb at exactly 8 p.m., like a silent predator claiming its territory. Naomi stepped inside, her heart a frantic bird against her ribs. She had traded her apron for a silk slip dress the color of midnight, a choice she made out of a desperate need to feel like an equal rather than a subordinate. The restaurant was not a public space, but a private terrace overlooking the city's jagged skyline, perched atop a building that didn't appear on any tourist map. Lorenzo was already there. He stood by the railing, the wind catching the edges of his white shirt, his profile sharp enough to cut glass. When he turned, his gaze didn't just meet hers, it anchored her. "You look exactly as I imagined you would," he said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to bypass her ears and strike her marrow. The table was set with a surgical precision that made Naomi's throat go dry. As they sat, a sommelier appeared from the shadows, pouring a deep, violet-hued liquid into her glass. Naomi took a cautious sip, and her eyes widened. It was a rare, vintage Malbec from a small estate in the Yucco Valley, a bottle she had mentioned once, 3 years ago, in a deleted blog post from her college days when she dreamed of being a sommelier herself. "This is..." She started, her voice trailing off as the rich, plum notes hit her tongue. "Complex. Patient." With a finish that lingers long after the glass is empty, Lorenzo finished for her, his eyes locked on hers. "Your favorite." A cold shiver raced down Naomi's spine, clashing violently with the heat radiating from his presence across the table. The chemistry between them was a live wire, sparking every time their eyes met, an undeniable pull that made her want to lean into his space. He was charming, attentive, and spoke with an intelligence that was as sharp as his jawline. But beneath the elegance, the voyeurism loomed. "How do you know that, Lorenzo?" she asked, her voice dropping. "I haven't talked about this wine in years. Not to anyone at the lounge. Not to my friends." Lorenzo didn't flinch. He picked up his glass, the light catching the floral ink on his neck. "I told you before, Naomi. I don't leave things to chance. When I find something, someone, truly remarkable, I believe in knowing exactly how to handle them." He reached across the table, his fingers grazing the back of her hand. The touch was light, but it felt like a claim. Naomi looked at his hand, then back at his face, caught in the terrifying realization that Roxy was right. The dinner, the wine, the perfect atmosphere, it wasn't a courtship. It was a demonstration of his reach. He hadn't just invited her to dinner, he was showing her that there was nowhere she had ever been, and nowhere she could ever go, that he hadn't already mapped out. The afterglow of the vintage Malbec and Lorenzo's electric touch evaporated the moment Naomi stepped across the threshold of her apartment. The brand new heater hummed with a clinical, predatory efficiency, mocking her with its silence. She stood in the dark for a long time, the key still clenched in her hand, listening to the heartbeat of a home that no longer felt like hers. She tried to tell herself it was paranoia, the byproduct of Roxy's bitter warnings and Lorenzo's terrifying omniscience. But as she moved through the small studio, a subtle discordance began to scream at her. On her nightstand, the paperback novel she had been reading was closed, its spine perfectly aligned with the edge of the wood. She remembered leaving it face down on page 112. In the bathroom, her toothbrush had been rotated 45 degrees. The air felt heavy, displaced, as if someone of immense mass had recently occupied the space. Naomi's breath hitched. She began to search, her movements frantic and jagged. She tore through her closet, checked under the sink, and ripped the cushions off her thrifted sofa. It wasn't until she collapsed onto her bed, heart thundering against her ribs, that she saw it. Tucked into the corner of the ceiling molding, directly above her pillows, was a tiny, glinting eye of glass. It was no larger than a shirt button, hidden behind a decorative flourish she had never noticed before. A pinhole lens, angled perfectly to capture every moment of her sleep, every private vulnerability, every tear shed in the dark. Her stomach did a slow, sickening flip. It wasn't just that he knew her favorite wine, he knew the way she looked when she was most alone. A cold rage began to replace the fear. She stood on the bed, her fingers trembling as she reached for the device, but her hand stopped midair. Next to the camera, resting on the narrow ledge of the molding, was a small, silver object that didn't belong. She picked it up. It was a cufflink. Heavy, silver, and engraved with a subtle, stylized D. He hadn't just sent technicians to install the surveillance, he had been here himself. He had stood in her sanctuary, breathed her air, and touched her things while she was away serving drinks at the lounge. The cufflink wasn't a mistake, it was a calling card. It was his way of telling her that the locks on her door were an illusion and that her privacy was a privilege he had revoked weeks ago. She gripped the silver cufflink so hard the metal bit into her palm. The electric chemistry of the dinner date now felt like a toxic film on her skin. She wasn't being courted. She was being curated, inch by inch, until there was nothing left of Naomi Kinsley that didn't belong to Lorenzo DeVante. The morning light was gray and unforgiving, filtering through the windows of a cramped coffee shop 3 blocks from Naomi's apartment. She sat huddled over a lukewarm latte, the silver cufflink still burning a hole in her pocket, when a man slid into the booth across from her. He didn't look like a predator, he looked like a weary accountant in a cheap suit, but the way he kept his back to the wall told a different story. Naomi Kinsley, he said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. He placed a leather wallet on the table, flipping it open to reveal a gold badge. I'm Special Agent Marcus Hale. FBI. Naomi didn't move. She didn't have the energy left for surprise. Does everyone in this city have a file on me, or just the men in suits? Hale didn't smile. He reached into a manila envelope and slid a thick stack of documents across the Formica tabletop. Lorenzo DeVante doesn't just have a file on you, Naomi. He has an obsession. And we have an obsession with him. She looked down at the first page. It was a criminal rap sheet that read like a history of violence, racketeering, aggravated assault, suspected homicides that never made it to trial because witnesses simply evaporated. The names of his associates were a list of the city's most untouchable monsters. But it was the second set of papers that made the coffee turn to lead in her stomach. Hale spread out a series of high-resolution surveillance photos. They weren't from the FBI. We intercepted these from a private server linked to DeVante's estate, Hale whispered. Naomi saw herself. She was walking to the subway 3 weeks ago. She was laughing at a joke a coworker made outside the lounge. She was standing at her kitchen window in her bathrobe, completely unaware that a long-range lens was capturing the vulnerability of her morning routine. The timestamps predated their boiling point confrontation at the bar by nearly a month. The random encounter you think you had? The spilled drink? The talkback? Hale leaned in, his voice urgent. It was choreographed. He scouted you like a target. He waited for the exact moment your guard was down to let you insult him, just so he could see how you'd taste. You aren't his girlfriend, Naomi. You're a person of interest in a federal investigation because you are currently the only person he allows within arm's reach. Naomi stared at a photo of herself sleeping, the same angle as the pinhole camera in her ceiling. The chemistry she had felt at dinner now felt like the phantom heat of a fever. He's a monster, Naomi, Hale said, his eyes hard. And right now, you're the only window we have into his world. Help us, or stay in that cage until he decides to stop feeding you. The Onyx Lounge was nearly empty when Lorenzo appeared, but the silence this time felt heavy, like the air before a lightning strike. Naomi didn't wait for him to take his corner booth. She met him in the center of the room, her hand trembling as she reached into her apron and pulled out the silver cufflink. She dropped it onto a cocktail table between them with a sharp clink that echoed against the walnut walls. You were in my home, she whispered, her voice lacking the fiery defiance of their first encounter. This time, it was brittle, paper-thin and vibrating with terror. The heater, the groceries, the camera, you've been in my bedroom, Lorenzo. You've been watching me for weeks before I ever knew your name. Lorenzo didn't flinch. He didn't offer a lie or a charming redirection. He stood with his hands loosely clasped behind his back, his presence expanding until the grand lounge felt like a broom closet. The teal neon light caught the ink on his neck, making the floral dragon seem to pulse against his throat. He looked down at the cufflink, then back at her, his expression as unreadable as a slab of black marble. I'm not a girl you can just cure it, Naomi continued, her breath coming in shallow hitches. She stepped back, her heels clicking on the polished floor. The FBI showed me the photos. They showed me the timestamps. You didn't just meet me. You hunted me. Hunted is a harsh word, Naomi, he said, his voice a low, melodic growl that made her knees weak despite her fear. He took a single step toward her, and instinctively, she recoiled. He stopped, his eyes narrowing. I prefer the term vetted. My world is built on blood and betrayal. I don't let people inside my circle, certainly not my heart, without knowing exactly what they are made of. What I'm made of, she choked out. I'm a waitress. I'm a person with a life that you've turned into a goddamn exhibit. Lorenzo moved then, faster than she could track, closing the distance until he was towering over her. He didn't touch her, but the heat radiating from his frame was stifling. He leaned down, his lips inches from her ear. I had to make sure you were worth the trouble, Naomi, he whispered, the honesty in his tone more chilling than any threat. I needed to see if that fire you showed me at the bar was real, or just a performance. I needed to see how you handled the dark when you thought no one was looking. He straightened up, his eyes locking onto hers with a possessive, terrifying intensity. Now I know. You're exactly what I thought you were. And now that I've invested this much time into your discovery, do you really think I'm just going to let you walk away? The fear Naomi felt now wasn't the sharp sting of a snap judgment, it was the cold, heavy realization that she was no longer the protagonist of her own life. She was a prize, and the man who held her had no intention of ever putting her back on the shelf. The tension in the air didn't just break, it shattered. The grand crystal chandelier above the bar shivered as the front doors of the Onyx Lounge were kicked open with a violence that made the floorboards groan. A spray of glass rained down as a black SUV surged onto the sidewalk, its headlights cutting through the dim, golden light like the eyes of a beast. Before Naomi could scream, Lorenzo's hand was a vice around her waist, yanking her behind the backlit Onyx bar. Men in dark tactical gear swarmed the entrance, their faces obscured by balaclavas. At their center stood a man who moved with a sickening, twitchy energy, Rowan Blackwell. He didn't look like a boss, he looked like a butcher. Lorenzo. Rowan's voice scraped against the walls, jagged and high. I heard you found a new toy. I thought I'd come to see if she's as unbreakable as they say. Gunfire erupted, a staccato rhythm that chewed through the expensive walnut paneling and turned premium liquor bottles into a glittering mist of glass and alcohol. Naomi huddled against the cold marble floor, her hands over her ears, the smell of cordite and spilled gin stinging her nose. Then, the man beside her changed. The Lorenzo who had bought her wine and watched her sleep, vanished. In his place was a creature of calculated, lethal precision. He didn't look afraid, he looked bored by the inconvenience. Without taking his eyes off the front of the room, Lorenzo pulled a suppressed handgun from a holster beneath the bar. Stay down, Naomi, he said. His voice was no longer a melodic growl, it was a flat, metallic command. He rose in one fluid motion. Naomi watched, frozen, as the man she had yelled at for being rude became a god of death. He moved with a horrifying, graceful economy, firing with a rhythm that was more like a heartbeat than a battle. Each shot was a period at the end of a sentence. 2 of Rowan's men fell before they could even level their sights. Lorenzo didn't duck. He didn't scramble. He walked toward Rowan through the haze of smoke and falling crystal, his white shirt a stark target that no one seemed able to hit. The Mafia boss wasn't just a title, it was a physical gravity that bent the room to his will. Rowan's bravado cracked. As Lorenzo reached the edge of the bar, he didn't fire. He grabbed a stray whiskey bottle and shattered it against the counter, stepping over the wreckage to drive the jagged glass into the shoulder of the nearest attacker with a sound that made Naomi's stomach turn. "Message received, Rowan," Lorenzo said, his voice carrying easily through the chaos. He stood over a whimpering guard, his face splattered with a fine mist of red, looking entirely at home in the carnage. "Tell your people the hunt is over. I've made my choice." Rowan scrambled back into the SUV, the engine roaring as they beat a desperate retreat. Silence returned to the lounge, heavier and darker than before. Lorenzo turned back to Naomi, the gun still in his hand, his eyes cold and empty of the warmth they had held at dinner. She looked at him, really looked at him, and realized that the man who had been watching her wasn't a protector. He was the storm. The blood on the marble floor was still wet when Naomi realized she couldn't stay. The image of Lorenzo standing in the wreckage of the lounge, his white shirt stained with Rowan's message, played on a loop in her mind. She didn't go back to her apartment. She knew the camera was there, its glass eye recording her panic. Instead, she hailed a yellow cab, her hands shaking as she shoved a handful of crumpled 20s toward the driver. "Grand Central," she rasped. "Fast." She had a backpack stuffed with a change of clothes and the shoebox of cash from under her bed, the money that was supposed to be her freedom but now felt like a tracking beacon. She watched the city blur past the window, her eyes darting to every black sedan and darkened SUV. The city felt smaller than it had an hour ago, the skyscrapers leaning in like prison bars. When the cab pulled up to the terminal, Naomi bolted. She sprinted toward the ticket kiosks, her breath coming in jagged, burning stabs. She didn't care where the train was going, upstate, Connecticut, anywhere that didn't smell like sandalwood and cordite. But as she reached for the screen, a hand, heavy, gloved, and immovable, rested on top of the machine. "The tracks are undergoing maintenance, Ms. Kinsley," a voice said. It wasn't Lorenzo, but it was a voice she recognized, one of the sentinels from the grocery store. Two men in charcoal coats stood on either side of her, their expressions as blank as a fresh grave. "Get away from me," Naomi hissed, spinning around to find a third man blocking her path to the platforms. "Mr. DeVante is concerned about the transit safety tonight," the man said, his tone polite and utterly terrifying. "He's requested we escort you to a more secure location." Naomi turned and ran toward the bus terminal, but the exit was already manned. At every door, every gate, and every taxi stand, she saw them, the military postures, the sharp suits, the silent nods. She was being herded. The entire infrastructure of the city had been reconfigured into a funnel, and she was the water being forced toward a single drain. She tried the subway, descending into the humid dark, but at the turnstile, a man stepped out from the shadows of a pillar. He didn't move to grab her, he simply held up a phone. On the screen was a live feed of the very platform she was standing on. "There is nowhere the light doesn't reach, Naomi," the man whispered. She backed away, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was the most protected woman in New York, and it was the most terrifying realization of her life. Lorenzo hadn't locked her in a room, he had locked the city. Every exit was a wall, every stranger was a guard, and the safety he provided was a velvet-lined coffin. She wasn't fleeing a predator, she was running circles inside his palm. The payphone in the back of the humid diner smelled of stale grease and old copper. Naomi's fingers fumbled with the receiver as she dialed the number Agent Hale had pressed into her hand. She had no other choice. Lorenzo had swallowed the city whole, and Hale was the only crack in the foundation. "I'm at the diner on 4th and Main," she whispered into the mouthpiece, her eyes darting toward the window. Outside, the rain blurred the headlights of passing cars into long, smeary streaks. "They're everywhere," Hale. I can't get out. Please. Stay put. Hale's voice was a steady, clinical anchor. I have a tactical team 2 minutes away. We're going to pull you out of the grid. If you see DeVante's men, don't run. Just wait for the blue lights. Naomi hung up, a fragile spark of hope igniting in her chest. She sat in a corner booth, her back to the wall, watching the seconds tick by on the grease-stained wall clock. When a black sedan pulled up to the curb, her heart stuttered. 2 men in suits stepped out, but before they could reach the door, a nondescript white van screeched to a halt, blocking their path. Federal agents swarmed out, badges glinting under the streetlights. Naomi let out a sob of relief. She saw Hale stepping toward the diner entrance, waving her forward. She grabbed her bag and ran, bursting through the door into the biting cold air. Hale, she cried, reaching for him. The agent caught her by the arm, his grip firm and professional. But as he led her toward the back of the van, the blue lights she expected didn't flash. Instead, the heavy sliding door creaked open to reveal a jagged, terrifyingly familiar face. Rowan Blackwell sat in the darkness of the van, his shoulder crudely bandaged and his eyes bright with a manic, feverish light. Naomi froze, her blood turning to ice. She looked back at Hale, but the agent wasn't reaching for his weapon. He was avoiding her eyes, his jaw set in a hard, guilty line. Sorry, Naomi, Hale muttered, his voice hollow. The Bureau doesn't pay as well as the Blackwells do. And Lorenzo needs to learn that even his favorites can be bought. Before she could scream, Rowan's hand shot out, his fingers tangling in her hair with a brutal, sickening yank. He pulled her into the van, the smell of cheap cigarettes and infection overwhelming her. Hale slammed the door shut, and the world went black. You really thought there was a good guy in this story, didn't you, princess? Rowan rasped, the cold steel of a blade pressing against her throat. Lorenzo's been watching you for weeks, but he forgot to watch his own back. Now, we're going to see just how much blood he's willing to spill to get his favorite toy back. As the van sped away into the night, Naomi realized the FBI hadn't been a window to freedom. They were just another set of eyes in a city that had decided she was no longer a woman, but a bargaining chip. The warehouse on the edge of the docks smelled of stagnant salt water and the metallic tang of Naomi's own fear. She was bound to a rusted chair, the coarse rope biting into her wrists, while Rowan Blackwell paced before her like a caged animal. He kept glancing at the heavy steel doors, his hand twitching over the hilt of a serrated knife. He was waiting for a ghost, but he didn't realize that ghosts don't knock. The lights didn't flicker, they simply died. In the sudden, suffocating dark, the only sound was the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of a suppressed weapon. One by one, Rowan's guards collapsed into the shadows without a cry, silenced by a predator that moved through the gloom with the grace of a phantom. A single emergency light kicked on, casting long, skeletal shadows across the floor. Lorenzo stood at the end of the aisle, his white shirt now a jagged map of crimson and grime. He didn't look like the man who had bought her vintage wine, he looked like the personification of a death sentence. He didn't take cover. He simply walked toward them, his eyes fixed on Rowan with a cold, terrifying vacuum of emotion. You took something that belongs to me, Rowan. Lorenzo's voice was a low, seismic rumble that vibrated through the concrete floor. That was your final mistake. Panicked, Rowan lunged for Naomi, grabbing her by the hair and pulling her head back. He fumbled a discarded handgun from the floor, pressing the hot muzzle against her temple. Stay back. One more step and I'll paint the floor with her. Lorenzo stopped 10 feet away. He didn't level his gun. He didn't even look at Rowan's weapon. He looked directly at Naomi. With a slow, deliberate motion, he tossed a second handgun across the floor. It skidded over the grit, stopping inches from Naomi's bound feet. Naomi, Lorenzo said, his voice eerily calm. I told you I needed to see what you were made of. Rowan is distracted. He's weak. The choice is yours. You can wait for me to kill him, or you can prove that you're the woman I know you are. Rowan's grip tightened, his hand shaking with a frantic, desperate energy. He's crazy. He's letting you die. Naomi looked at the gun on the floor, then up at Lorenzo. He wasn't moving to save her. He was watching her, testing her, demanding that she shed the last of her innocence to enter his world. The monster wasn't coming to be her hero, he was coming to be her mirror. She felt the ropes loosen, a gift of her own frantic struggle. With a primal scream of defiance, Naomi threw her weight forward, her fingers closing around the cold steel of the pistol. She didn't think about the FBI or the lounge or the life she used to have. She only thought about the man holding her hair and the man watching her from the dark. She pulled the trigger. The roar of the gun echoed through the hollow warehouse, and the weight of Rowan Blackwell vanished. Naomi stood there, chest heaving, the gun heavy and hot in her hand. Lorenzo walked through the smoke, his hand reaching out to catch her as her knees finally buckled. He didn't offer comfort. He took the gun from her hand and pressed a kiss to her forehead, the smell of sandalwood and blood finally becoming her new reality. The transition from the warehouse to the penthouse was a blur of tinted glass and high-speed silence. Now, Naomi stood on the balcony of Lorenzo's estate, wrapped in a robe of heavy black silk that felt like liquid midnight against her skin. The city below was a sprawling carpet of light, but it no longer looked like a place she lived in. It looked like a territory she oversaw. Behind her, the sliding glass door hummed open. She didn't need to turn to know it was him. The scent of sandalwood and expensive tobacco preceded him, a fragrance that had once signaled terror but now felt like the only oxygen she was allowed to breathe. "The sun will be up in an hour," Lorenzo said, his voice a low, possessive vibration. He stepped into her space, his hands resting on the railing on either side of her, effectively caging her against his chest. He had showered away the blood of the warehouse, but the intensity in his eyes remained, a permanent, predatory glow. Naomi looked down at her hands. They were steady now, but the ghost of the gun's recoil still thrummed in her palms. "I can't go back to the lounge, can I?" The lounge was a stage, Naomi. "You've graduated to the throne," Lorenzo whispered, leaning down to press his lips against the column of her neck, right where the pulse beat strongest. "The girl who took orders from strangers died in that warehouse. The woman who stands here now, she is the only one I answer to." It was a beautiful lie, and they both knew it. He didn't answer her, he had simply absorbed her. She thought of her small studio apartment, the flickering heater, and the piles of bills that had once defined her struggle. They felt like relics from a different century. In this new world, her debts were gone, her enemies were buried, and her safety was guaranteed by the most feared man in the tri-state area. But the price of that safety was total. She looked at the reflection in the glass. She didn't see a waitress. She saw a woman draped in the spoils of a dark empire, her eyes hardened by the realization that she had crossed a line that only moved in one direction. There would be no more subway rides, no more talking back to customers, and no more anonymity. She was the Queen of Onyx, a title written in the blood she had spilled to save herself. Naomi leaned back into him, her head resting against his shoulder. The fear hadn't entirely vanished, but it had evolved into a cold, intoxicating power. She had been watched for weeks, curated like a masterpiece, and finally claimed. "Tell me," she murmured, watching the first light of dawn hit the skyscrapers. "What does a queen do first?" Lorenzo's grip tightened, his smile sharp and satisfied against her skin. "She learns how to rule the people who used to look down on her." The sun rose, but for Naomi Kinsley, the world remained a brilliant, gilded shade of black. She had found her place in the dark, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of the shadows. She was the shadow.